warning, this episode discusses themes some listeners may find distressing.
Welcome back to the Standard Podcast, and I'm Mark Blunden. The British cousin of an Israeli hostage held by Hamas in Gaza has described his family's ongoing anguish ahead of a milestone update on the fate of remaining captives this weekend. Adam Manit, who's from Brighton and is Digital Communications Officer at the Board of Deputies of British Jews, told the Standard Podcast they are hoping for news very soon about Tsachi Idan, who is among 94 remaining hostages and was dragged away from his kibbutz home after his 18-year-old daughter, Maayan, was shot dead by a Hamas gunman in the October 7th terror attacks over 15 months ago. It follows a phased ceasefire deal that saw the first 3 hostages released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, with further releases scheduled. But it comes amid a spike in anti-Semitic attacks and shortly before Holocaust Memorial Day on Monday. Adam joins us now. Please could you tell us what happened to Tsachi and his family on the 7th of October 2023?
At 6:29 a.m. in the morning on October 7th, it's a Jewish holiday, Simchat Torah. My family live in a community called Nir Oz, very close to the Gaza border. One of the consequences of living in that area is that rocket attacks are quite regular, quite frequent, and all of the homes in those communities have rocket shelters. The children sleep in the rocket shelter usually just to save time because you have about 15 seconds to get to safety if you hear a siren. And so it's just easier to keep the children in the rocket shelter as their bedroom. My family heard the rocket siren, then they quickly rushed into the bomb shelter thinking this was a quote-unquote normal rocket attack. Very quickly they understood that this was something else because there were hundreds and hundreds of rockets going by. Their WhatsApp group from the community of Nir Oz, they received an alert that intruders had gained access to the community, and very soon after that they heard gunfire. That's when they knew things were getting really bad. My cousin Tsachi was with his wife and 3 of his 4 children. They were hiding out in the rocket shelter when they heard the voice of a 17-year-old neighbor, Tomer, who they identified by his voice. He was speaking to them in Hebrew, trying to lure them out, telling them everything would be okay, and they knew that he was saying this under duress. What actually happened was that the terrorists had taken Tomer by gunpoint and marched him door to door, trying to lure out any families from hiding. And eventually, when they were done with him, he was killed. At the time, they didn't come out, and Tsachi was barricading the door with his body. These are rocket shelters, not designed for intrusion, so the door itself is not locked or reinforced. So he could only barricade it with his body. His eldest daughter, Maayan, was with him. She had just turned 18 only a few days before. The balloons from her birthday party were still up in the house. She, perhaps feeling a sense of responsibility as a newly young adult, decided to go and help her father protect her family and help to barricade the door. That was when the terrorists got frustrated and they decided to shoot through the door, and they shot Maayan in the head. Tsachi had to see his firstborn daughter die in his arms. He desperately tried to resuscitate her, to no avail. It was a killing blow. Meanwhile, the terrorists had gained entry to the rocket shelter, taken the rest of the family out, and they forced Gali, Maayan's mother, Tsachi's wife, to unlock her phone so that they could live stream the family's horror onto her Facebook page. That's how most of my family found out what was happening. It was also how a lot of the world found out, because it became one of the first early clips from the October 7th massacre. There's a scene in it where the 2 youngest ones, Shahar, 9, and Yael, 11, are talking to the terrorists. Shahar is crying uncontrollably because he'd just seen his eldest sister murdered in front of his eyes. Terrorists are trying to shush him, telling him to shut up, and Yael bravely, speaking to them in English, says, "You killed his sister," basically explaining why he can't stop crying. And the terrorist responds in English, "She's with your God now." Eventually, after a few hours of this, the terrorists had taken our neighbors, the Miran family, Omri, Lishai, and their 2 small children, Alma and Roni, ages 1 and 3, brought them into the sitting room in our house in Nir Oz, and then eventually decided to, thinking that the IDF might be approaching, that they needed to take some collateral with them or something, they took Tsachi and they took Omri, the neighbor, and they frog marched them to Gaza. Tsachi still with the blood of his firstborn all over his clothes and skin. That was the last time we seen him in person.
And a warning, you're about to hear some distressing audio recorded shortly after Maayan was murdered. Her little sister asking in Hebrew, is there no chance she will come back?
No, it's sister. My sister died.
And what news have you had these awful past 15 months? And are you expecting some updates over the weekend?
The only time we've had any proof of life of Tsachi was when he appeared in a Hamas propaganda video in January 2024. They did this regularly with the hostages, where they would parade them on camera and force them to say things in Hebrew, and then they would sometimes treat it like a game show, and they would say, are they alive or are they dead? And they wouldn't answer the question. They would just leave you to wonder. And Tsachi appeared in one of those videos, and they claimed that he was dead, but they didn't show his body. And they've not been shy about showing hostage bodies. So we're taking that to assume that he's still alive, and we've been operating under that assumption. He's never been visited by the Red Cross. He's never been visited by a UN diplomat or a diplomat from the British government. And so we just live day to day with the assumption that he's alive and the hope that he's alive, but we don't have any further proof. We will be expecting from the current deal that this Saturday they will be announcing who's alive and who's dead amongst the hostages. So we will know soon.
And so no information in terms of location, condition, nothing?
Nothing. Like I said, they've not been visited by any kind of third party, Red Cross, diplomat, or any other. We have no information about anyone's health or well-being. And we live each day hoping for the best, but we can't be sure. We do know that of the phase 1 list of hostages, which is 33 names, some of those people will be dead.
Welcome back. Has the British government been doing enough for family? Who's been offering you support here in the UK?
Immediately after October 7th, I wrote to the Foreign Office. They had a special email address for anyone affected by the October 7th events. I'm a British citizen. I live in Brighton. And I asked the Foreign Office for help with my cousin. I gave them full details, his ID, and all sorts of information. I never heard back from them. I've repeatedly asked for assistance from the Foreign Office and the government whenever I've had the opportunity. I've had the lawyers representing the British connected hostages requesting to add me to the list, and they were denied. I've met the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister at 10 Downing Street in September last year, and I asked directly if they could help me support my cousin in some way. They both promised that they would look into it, but I've never heard back from them. Recently, I was on the BBC where I was talking about my cousin, and they read out a statement from the Foreign Office where the Foreign Office essentially absolved themselves of responsibility for my cousin because he's not a close enough relative to mine.
What about wider support in terms of other organisations, community and relatives?
I'm fortunate that I get to work at the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who have been incredibly supportive of me and my family and have allowed me time to campaign for the hostages and have integrated that into my work as part of my day job. I've also been very fortunate to work with other British connected hostage families who we work together. There are currently 8 of the 94 hostages who have British relatives here, and we've been working very closely together. We have support from the Israeli embassy and the Israeli government. We have support from the Hostage Families Forum, which is a network of all of the hostage families. Never had any support from the United Kingdom.
Tsachi's children, surviving relatives, are they getting counselling and support to help them deal with this in some way?
They are, as you can imagine. It's been a very traumatic period for them. It's been 15 months since their eldest sister, firstborn daughter, was murdered, and all of the family are receiving complex care for grief and trauma counselling. They not only lost Maayan, and had to bury her without their father, without their husband, Tsachi, but they've also been rendered homeless because the entire home and the community has been destroyed by the terrorist attacks on October 7th. So they've been living at the largesse of another community up north in Israel. That's also been very destabilizing and difficult for everyone involved. And it's just something that has been very difficult for the children, especially the youngest children, to deal with. And right now, the main focus of their hopes and dreams is on returning Tsachi to them so that they can grieve together.
And of course, this trauma has been compounded by the technological element as well, this live streaming.
Well, quite. And we also have multiple angles of the horror because the terrorists themselves were wearing GoPros. The footage from that has also been recovered from the IDF. So we actually have the full sequence of events, hours of footage where we can see every detail of their trauma unfold before us. You know, there's scenes where you can see Tsachi sort of checked out. He's pale and clearly all the symptoms, the visible symptoms of shock as he's trying to process what just happened to his eldest child, his beloved child, who was murdered in front of his eyes and died in his arms. And you can see that Gali is trying to hold it together, trying to protect two of the three remaining children that she had with her as best she could by complying with the terrorist demands, protecting them from the rockets as the rockets were flying overhead. It was all a very horrendous ordeal. And we also live with the reality that, you know, a lot of the world had seen that footage and clips of that footage. And so know my family through seeing those scenes themselves and constantly being reminded of it just by being on social media or the news, seeing those clips being replayed over and over again. It's impossible to ignore.
Last week, we had the hopefully heartening news of a long-awaited ceasefire. What's your view? Can it hold?
The ceasefire follows from the hostage release. The hostage release is the linchpin that unlocks all the other pathways for ceasefire and aid and rebuilding and cessation of the conflict. And I think that's what people seem to kind of lose sight of, is that there's still 94 men, women, and children. Let us not forget that their youngest hostage is a 2-year-old who was taken in 9 months and whose second birthday we only just recently marked last Saturday. His older brother, Ariel, who's 5, and some very elderly hostages with medical conditions and complex medical needs, like Shlomo Mansour, who's 86, who survived the Farhud pogrom against Jews in Baghdad, and Oded Lifshitz, whose daughter lives in London and who is very worried about his well-being. So I think that if we are to have any hope of an end to the conflict, we need to ensure that the hostages are all returned safe and well, all of them, including hostages that were taken before October 7th. There are still 3 hostages remaining in the list of 94 who were taken before October 7th. Some have been held by Hamas as long as 10 years. One was recently recovered by the IDF after 10 and a half years of captivity. He was dead, but it allowed his family some semblance of closure to be able to bury their son. So I think it's really important for Israeli society, which is in a state of trauma and shock from one of the worst massacres of Jews since the Holocaust, a historical event that won't ever be forgotten, an atrocity. I think it's really important that for Israeli society that the hostages be returned so that a healing process can begin.
Attacks have seen a spike in anti-Semitism, and of course, as you say, it's a salient reminder. We're just days away from Holocaust Memorial Day on Monday as well.
We are. It's going to be the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I've had family of my own murdered in Auschwitz. I've had a whole wings of my family murdered by the Nazis in ditches they were forced to dig themselves, or at concentration camps like Jasenovic or Auschwitz. My mother was born in hiding in a wine cellar in Italy from Nazis and didn't see the light of day for a full year before the end of the war. So I'm very aware of the history of the persecution and oppression of Jews. And it's very difficult to think about 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz and not think about how we are right now living in a period of time where there are record levels of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents. Just the other day, a Jewish preschool was set alight and graffitied with F the Jews in Australia and Sydney. This was not the first arson attack against Jewish sites there. Just in the last month, 2 synagogues were attacked and the home of a Jewish community leader were attacked with arson and graffiti. So I think, around the world, not just in the UK, but around the world, we are seeing epidemic proportions of anti-Semitism, and it's alarming. And I think as we move into the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I think it's an important time to reflect on the state of things as they are now, and realize that I don't think we've completely internalized the lessons from that period of time in the past, and certainly aren't doing enough to protect Jewish communities in the diaspora.
And that's The Standard. For the latest news, head over to standard.co.uk. This podcast is back tomorrow at 4 p.m.